The 9,660th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Czechia, Denmark, Germany, Italy, Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite Her Excellency Ms. Hedda Samson, Charge d'Affaires of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you, Mr. President. This past weekend, many world leaders came together in Switzerland to build consensus on the elements of a just peace in Ukraine. Those discussions took place in the wake of a sharp escalation of hostilities and an appalling increase in civilian casualties. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, this May, at least 174 civilians were killed and 690 injured in Ukraine. This is the highest number of civilian casualties in a single month since June last year. More than half of these casualties occurred in the Kharkiv region due to the Russian Federation's new offensive, launched on 10 May. There has been massive use of explosive weapons both in the Kharkiv region and in Kharkiv city, the second biggest city in Ukraine with over 1 million residents. On 23 May, missiles struck a printing house, killing 7 employees. On 25 May, 2 airdrop bombs struck a large home improvement center, killing 19 people. And on 31 May, missiles hit a residential area in the city, including a multi-story building, killing 9 civilians. North of Kharkiv city, the border town of Vovchansk saw some of the most intense fighting in the past month. It is now almost completely destroyed, with thousands of its residents forced to flee. This is a repeat of the devastation visited on Mariupol, Bakhmut, and Avdiivka earlier in the war. While Kharkiv has been the region most affected by the recent intensification of fightings, civilians continue to be killed and injured in other parts of Ukraine. Last week, on 13 June, an attack on Kryvyi Rih killed at least 9 people, including 5 children. Regular shelling and missile attacks by Russian Federation forces have also been reported in the Kherson region, including the city of Kherson, resulting in civilian casualties and forcing many of the city's residents to flee. The escalation of attacks impacting Ukrainian civilians is unconscionable. Since February 2022, OHCHR has recorded 11,126 civilians killed and 21,863 civilians injured. The actual figures are likely significantly higher. In the same period, Russian authorities have reported that at least 91 civilians have been killed and 455 injured in the Russian Federation, primarily in the Belgorod, Bryansk, and Kursk regions bordering Ukraine. We once again stress that attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited by international law. They must stop immediately. Mr. President, the relentless attacks have also caused massive damage to civilian infrastructure. Even before the current escalation, A joint rapid damage and needs assessment conducted by Ukraine, the United Nations, the World Bank Group, and the European Commission estimated that, as of December 2023, reconstruction and recovery in Ukraine would cost some $486 billion over the next decade. Last week's recovery conference in Berlin demonstrated international solidarity and support for Ukraine's path to recovery. The longer the war continues, the greater the need for this global solidarity and support. The large-scale attacks by the Russian Federation against energy infrastructure have reduced Ukraine's energy-generating capacity by 68%. Periodic strikes imperiling the critical power supply to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant have also continued. Any attacks involving nuclear facilities are extremely dangerous and irresponsible. They must cease immediately. The United Nations Development Program has backed the provision of stable energy access for over 6 million people in Ukraine and is preparing for further delivery of energy equipment to help address shortages. But the worst consequences of the attacks against energy infrastructure are yet to be felt. This is because the shelling and airstrikes are also making it difficult to complete the repair of damaged facilities before next winter. Mr. President, the intensified hostilities add to the already difficult humanitarian situation. Thousands of people have been forced to flee their homes, and the UN is working with Ukrainian authorities to meet their immediate demands. So far this year, together with our partners, we have reached more than 4.4 million people with humanitarian assistance, thanks to our donors. The 2024 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan is currently 27% funded. We urge our donors to sustain their generous financial support. This will allow us to continue to deliver life-saving assistance to the vulnerable population. Adequate funding is an issue everywhere, but for approximately 1.5 million people in need of humanitarian assistance in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia regions of Ukraine currently under Russian occupation, the key challenge remains lack of access. International humanitarian law requires the facilitation of rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for all civilians in need, no matter where they live. We urge the Russian Federation to enable humanitarian access to areas under its control. Mr. President, this war has affected countries far beyond Ukraine's borders. The latest global report on food crises shows that in 2023, nearly 282 million people in 59 countries faced high levels of acute food insecurity. This represents an additional 24 million people since 2022. This rise has been driven by unfavorable crop conditions for the 2024 harvest and damage to shipping infrastructure and disruptions in navigation in the Black Sea and elsewhere. Over 80% of global trade is by sea. The Black Sea is a critical route, estimated to account for over a quarter of grain trade. Much more needs to be done to mitigate risks, reduce transaction costs, and bring more stability in global agricultural markets. The UN has therefore highlighted the importance of stabilizing critical trade routes for agricultural products. Mr. President, the human rights situation in the regions of Ukraine under Russian occupation remains extremely concerning. OHCHR has interviewed dozens of people who recently fled these regions. They report increased pressure to obtain Russian passports linked to the Russian presidential decree of 27 April 2023. According to the decree, people without Russian citizenship in the occupied areas of Ukraine's Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk regions will be considered foreigners after 1 July 2024. International humanitarian law prohibits an occupying power from compelling the population in occupied territory to swear allegiance to it. This includes forcing the population to obtain the occupying power's citizenship. Further, OHCHR has interviewed hundreds of released Ukrainian prisoners of war who recounted systematic and widespread torture and ill treatment, including sexual violence. We welcome the prisoner exchange of 31 May, in which 150 people were released, and urge the parties to continue and scale up such exchanges. There must be accountability for all violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, wherever they occur, in line with international norms and standards. Mr. President, 2.5 years since the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there is no let-up in the killing and destruction. The broader region is less stable and safe, while other parts of the world watch nervously as they continue to feel the economic and political consequences of the conflict. At the same time, discussion on possible ways to peace are multiplying. In Switzerland, over the weekend, many voices stress the need to adhere to the principles of the UN Charter. I'd like to stress that these principles are as valid today as they were in 1945. The Secretary General has been consistent and clear, calling for a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in Ukraine, in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant General Assembly resolutions. The United Nations welcomes and is ready to support all meaningful efforts and initiatives towards this end. Thank you.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm pleased that Ms. DiCarlo was able to brief us today, and my country thanks her for her participation at the Peace Summit in Switzerland. It was important to have the United Nations represented at this event. Any peace begins and ends with the full respect of the UN Charter, international law, and relevant resolutions of the UN General Assembly. Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to congratulate Switzerland for hosting a successful summit on peace in Ukraine in Bürgenstock last weekend, attended by almost 100 delegations. A joint communiqué signed by the vast majority of them provides palpable groundwork for a process that should bring peace to Ukraine and stability to the wider region. Peace and stability that are desperately needed and cannot arrive too soon. For every day and week that diplomacy is postponed, drones are maiming civilians and ballistic missiles are destroying critical civilian infrastructure across Ukraine. Mr. President, we are obliged to identify avenues that will produce a just peace for Ukraine. This peace process is not anti-Russian. However, one would be right if they would view it as a rejection of aggression. One would also be right if they would view it as an instance of rejecting the use of military force for achieving political goals over diplomacy. And one would first and foremost be right to see it as a voice for upholding the international law, including the UN Charter. Without respecting fundamental principles of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, there cannot be a lasting and sustainable peace. As my president, Ms. Pils-Musser, put it at the summit, and I quote, "The summit is a gathering of states firmly convinced that the international order, based on the fundamental principles of international law and friendly relations between states, must be preserved," end of quote. At the same time, Slovenia is aware that there cannot be peace without the involvement of and dialogue between all parties. We hope that the Russian Federation will demonstrate genuine willingness to end the war and engage in good faith in negotiations based on international norms. Mr. President, the Charter is a document that has survived many challenges through its 79 years. Based on experience from the war, it provides answers and guidance to solving international problems peacefully. But at no point it justifies the aggression as a way of ending disagreements. The UN and its charter are the glue that holds this post-war collective security together. It is in none interest to see this system erode and collapse. That is why we see this peace summit on Ukraine in Switzerland as a first step in restoring the integrity of the Charter. Yes, not all UN members were present, and the Russian Federation was missing, but it was a first step, an opening of peace discussions. We should bring these discussions here to the UN, where they belong, and hopefully Russian Federation will get on board. It is in the prime interest of us all, and especially of the permanent members of the Council, to have relevance of the Charter and relevance of the Council restored and reconfirmed. This should be first and foremost in the Russian interest. Mr. President, in order to provide people of Ukraine and people of Russia, for that matter, with a secure future, perhaps what this Council needs to start with is building trust. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Undersecretary General DiCarlo, for your briefing today. This past weekend, scores of delegates hailing from around the world gathered in Switzerland for the Summit on Peace in Ukraine. Together, 82 signatories to the joint communique sent a message, loud and clear to Russia: Ukraine is not alone. That together, we are committed to achieving a just and lasting peace, consistent with the principles and purposes of the UN Charter. Because the people of Ukraine, who for over 2.5 years have demonstrated extraordinary resilience, resourcefulness, resolve, deserve nothing less. This summit allowed last week's Reconstruction Conference in Germany, which convened over 1,500 representatives from governments, businesses, and civil society to mobilize support for the Ukraine's recovery. It was an important step toward addressing the devastating impacts of Russia's unjust war on the people across Ukraine. And it offered an opportunity for Ukraine, in collaboration with a diverse set of countries and organizations, to agree on a potential framework for a future peace settlement with Russia that is in line with the UN Charter. But for everything this summit was, it's important to note what it was not. Namely, the summit was not a formal negotiation. After all, a negotiated end to the war will require both Russia and Ukraine at the table in good faith. And at no point in more than 2 years has the Kremlin demonstrated a good faith effort to engage Ukraine in peace talks or to end the war. Instead, Russia has continued to carry out massive missile and drone strikes, resulting in civilian casualties in Kharkiv. It has forcibly transferred or deported thousands of Ukrainian children and unjustly detained thousands more Ukrainian civilians. And it has sharply escalated its attacks on Ukraine's energy grid, taking more than 9 gigawatts of power generation capacity offline since February of 2024. For reference, that's enough energy to power over 6 million homes. Let's call it what it is. The Kremlin wants Ukraine to accept an unjust peace that rewards Russia's aggression while facing the barrel of a gun. It is, as Vice President Harris said at the Geneva summit, and I quote, an outrageous attempt to subjugate a free people and an attempt to wipe a sovereign state off the map, unquote. Indeed, while dozens of organizations gather to discuss humanitarian assistance and a plan to rebuild Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, Putin was preparing to discuss military arms with Kim Jong-un. And just days ago, Russia launched a total of 4 possible non-North Korean supplied ballistic missiles toward Ukraine, 2 on June 15th and 2 more on June 16th. Instead of adhering to Council resolutions, Russia flagrantly violates them. All the while, Russia's so-called peace plan, released just days before states gathered in Switzerland, fools no one. Demanding Ukraine withdraw from its internationally recognized territory before considering negotiations mocks the very principle this organization was created to reject, that countries may not acquire territory through force. Again, to quote Vice President Harris at the summit, President Putin is not calling for negotiations, he is calling for surrender. The Russian representative has himself used this language. Last April, in this very chamber, he said, and I quote, "Soon the only topic for any international meeting on Ukraine will be the unconditional surrender of the Kyiv regime," end quote. Colleagues, we must urge Russia to come to the table ready for constructive, fair dialogue. But we must also ensure Ukraine is at the head of that table and in the strongest possible position. Any discussion about a negotiated settlement is, at its core, a discussion about Ukraine's future. A sovereign Ukraine should be the party leading these discussions, period. All of us would expect the same if we were in Ukraine's position. Therefore, those countries interested in promoting a durable peace rooted in the UN Charter must engage closely and directly with Ukraine and must urge Russia to cease this senseless war. To that end, we regret that, adding insult to injury, China released its own quote-unquote peace plan, one formulated without any buy-in from Ukraine itself. If China is genuinely interested in supporting the peace process, we would welcome its help. It can start by ending its support to Russia's defense industrial base. Without the substantial quantities of machine tools, microelectronics, optics, and UAV and cruise missile technology provided by China, Russia would struggle to sustain its war of aggression. What's more, China can join the international community in demanding accountability for atrocities committed in Ukraine and against the Ukrainian people. There can be no lasting peace without justice for the victims of Russia's aggression. Finally, all of us must increase our efforts to support the recovery, reconstruction, reform, and modernization of Ukraine. And I'm proud that the United States at last week's Reconstruction Conference pledged $824 million to help rebuild Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Colleagues, Russia started this brutal, unprovoked war against Ukraine, and Russia could end it at any time. But until that day, we must stand by Ukraine as it seeks a just and lasting peace, consistent with the UN Charter. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie la secrétaire générale adjointe Rosemary DiCarlo pour son intervention. Nous remercions les Nations Unies pour leur soutien sans faille depuis le début de cette guerre à la recherche d'une paix guidée par le droit international, notamment les principes de la Charte des Nations Unies et par les résolutions de l'Assemblée générale. Nous devons avoir le courage de construire la paix. Et pour ce faire, nous devons en parler. Le 15 et le 16 juin, plus de 100 pays du monde entier, d'organisations internationales et de représentants religieux se sont réunis pour discuter de comment lancer un processus de paix basé sur les droits internationaux et notamment la Charte des Nations Unies. Ceci constitue un signal clair en faveur d'une paix juste et durable en Ukraine. Nous tenons à remercier tous ceux et toutes celles qui ont accepté notre invitation et qui ont contribué à la réussite de ce sommet au Bürgenstock. Pour la première fois, nous avons discuté de la paix en Ukraine au plus haut niveau. Les discussions de ces 2 jours ont été l'occasion d'écouter des idées différentes, d'apprendre des expériences des uns et des autres et de proposer des solutions possibles. Ces discussions ont permis de mieux comprendre les points de vue pour en dégager une vision commune. Le communiqué commun, adopté par la grande majorité des pays participants, représente un résultat concret du sommet. Nous continuons à recevoir des adhérents et invitons tous les pays à le soutenir. Les positions formulées conjointement fournissent le cadre autour duquel de nouvelles discussions devraient avoir lieu. Il est important qu'une vision commune ait été établie sur les 3 objectifs clés suivants. Premièrement, l'utilisation sûre et sécurisée des centrales et des installations nucléaires ukrainiennes et l'inadmissibilité de toute menace ou utilisation d'armes nucléaires. Deuxièmement, la navigation commerciale libre, complète et sûre et l'accès aux ports maritimes de la mer Noire et de la mer d'Azov. La sécurité alimentaire ne doit en aucun cas être militarisée. Troisièmement, tous les prisonniers de guerre doivent être libérés dans le cadre d'un échange complet. Tous les enfants ukrainiens déportés et déplacés illégalement, ainsi que tous les autres civils ukrainiens détenus arbitrairement, doivent retourner en Ukraine. Ces thèmes peuvent constituer des mesures de confiance entre les parties au conflit. En outre, il s'agit de thèmes qui revêtent une grande importance pour de nombreux pays qui sont touchés par les conséquences de la guerre. Par exemple, suite à la hausse des prix des denrées alimentaires ou qui ont eux-mêmes vécu un conflit et souhaitent partager leur expérience. Il est évident que pour parvenir à la paix, il faudra que toutes les parties s'engagent et entament un dialogue. Monsieur le Président, la participation à haut niveau d'États et organisations le week-end dernier nous a permis de lancer un large dialogue et de développer des idées communes. Ensemble, nous avons effectué un travail de fond important. Nous devons maintenant nous assurer que nous poursuivons sur cette lancée. Des efforts supplémentaires sont nécessaires pour progresser vers une paix juste et durable en Ukraine. La Suisse reste un partenaire pour la paix et le dialogue. Il est nécessaire de poursuivre l'engagement au-delà de ce premier sommet. Il n'y a pas de temps à perdre. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，
President,
我感谢迪卡洛副秘
I
书长的
thank
通报。
USG DiCarlo for her briefing.
从乌克兰危机全面升级
Since
伊
the
始，
onset of the full escalation
中
of
方
the
就一直
Ukraine
在为和平
crisis,
奔走，
China has
为
never
促
stopped
谈
pushing
努
for
力。
peace and promoting peace
中国
talks.
领导人一再
The
强调，
Chinese leadership has
为
repeatedly
推动政治解
emphasized
决乌克兰危
that
机，
in order to advance the
各国
political
的主
settlement
权、
of the
领土
Ukraine
完整
crisis,
都
it
应
is
该得到尊重。
imperative to respect the sovereignty and territorial
联合国
integrity
宪章的
of
宗旨
all
和原
states,
则
to abide
都
by
应
the
该得到
purposes and
遵守。
principles of the UN Charter,
各国合理
to
安全关切都应该得到重
the
视。
legitimate security
一
concerns
切
of
有
all
利于和
states,
平解决危机的努
and to
力
support all
都
efforts
应该得到支持。
conducive to the peaceful settlement of the crisis.
令人担忧的是，
It is worrying
乌克兰的战火
that
仍在
the
延宕，
fighting in
尚
Ukraine
未看到
persists
停息的迹象。
with no sign of
战斗
cessation.
每持续一天，
One more day of
造成的
fighting
伤亡
means more
就会
people
增加一
will
些。
die or become injured.
冲突每持续一
Another
天，
day of
升级
conflict
甚至失控的
increases
风
the
险
risk of
就
escalation
会上
and
升一些。
potential loss of control.
尽快停火止战，
achieving an
早
immediate
日恢
ceasefire,
复和平，
restoring peace at
建
the
立
earliest
均衡、有
opportunity,
效、
and
可持续的
establishing a
欧洲安
balanced,
全框架，
effective, and sustainable
符合
European
有关各
security
方的共同利益，
architecture. All these
也
serve
是
the
国际
common
社会
interests
的
of all
共
parties
同期盼。
concerned and reflect the collective aspirations of the international community.
一段时间以来，
For some time now,
包括中国在内的
China
有关
and
方面，
other relevant
为推动
parties
乌克兰危
have
机政
put
治解决
forward a
提
great
出不
number
少
of
倡议
initiatives
和主
and
张，
proposals for advancing the
这既
political
是国际
settlement
社
of
会
the
和
Ukraine
平努力的
crisis.
一部分，
They constitute part and
也是
parcel
为
of the
最终
international
促
peace
成和谈过
efforts
程中
and
的
mark
重要步骤。
important steps forward in the process
我们希
leading
望
up
所
to
有这些
final
倡
peace
议、
talks.
主
It
张、
is our
努力
hope that all these
汇
initiatives,
聚在一起，
proposals, and endeavor
能够
working
促
in
进冲突
synergy
当事方
can
的和平意
strengthen
愿，
the parties' readiness
强
to
化国际
embrace
社会
peace
劝
and
和
can
促谈的
bolster
势
the
头，
international momentum for peace
并
talks,
最终推动问题
leading
的政治解
eventually
决。
to a political settlement.
前不久，
Not long
为鼓
ago,
励和支持有助于
with a
缓和
view
局
to
势的努力，
encouraging and demonstrating
中
support
国
for
和巴
efforts
西
conducive
共
to
同
easing
提
the
出
situation,
关于乌
China
克兰
and
危机的
Brazil
6点
jointly
共识，
launched the six-point common
强调对
understandings
话
on the
谈
Ukraine
判
crisis,
是解决危
emphasizing
机的
that dialogue and
唯一可
negotiation
行出
are
路。
the only viable solution to the
各方
Ukraine
应为恢复
crisis,
直接对
calling
话
for all
创造
parties to
条件，
create conditions for the
推
resumption
动
of
局势降温
dialogue
缓
and
和，
push for the
直至
de-escalation
达
of the
成
situation
全面停火。
until the realization of a comprehensive ceasefire.
6点共识符
The
合大
six-point
多数
common
国家的共同
understandings
期盼，
speak to the shared aspirations
反
by
映
the
当前
majority
国
of
际
the
社会
states
围绕
and
乌克兰危
represent
机
the broadest
能
possible
够形
common
成的
ground
最大公
at
约数，
international level on the Ukraine
也得到了
crisis.
世界上许多
It
国
has
家的
also
响应。
received responses from many countries in
我
the
们希望
world.
有更多的
We
国家
encourage more
能够
countries
支持6点
to
共识，
support the
能
six-point
够为
common
共同为和
understandings
平
so as to
努力奔走。
jointly work for peace.
主席，
President,
中方所有外交努
at
力
the
释放的信
diplomatic
息
level,
是一
everything
致的
that，China has been doing
那就是
always
劝和促
comes
谈
back to the same message,
政治解决。
that is to bring the parties to the
历史
negotiating
早已
table
证明
and to achieve a
任
political
何冲突的
settlement.
终点
It's long been
都
proven
是
by
谈判
history
桌。
that the end point of every conflict
我们呼吁
is the
冲突当事
negotiating
方
table. We call on
展
parties
现
to the
政治
conflict
意愿，
to demonstrate their
相向而
political
行，
will to move towards each
早日
other and
开
to
启和
start
谈。
peace talks as soon as possible.
我们同时呼吁
We also
有关国家
call on the
秉持
countries
客观公
concerned
正立
to
场，
uphold objectivity
能够
and
为此创造
impartiality
有利
and
条
to
件。
create conducive conditions to that end.
我们特别要呼吁美
We in
国
particular call on the United
能够
States
为早日结束战争、
to work for an
恢复
early
和平
end of
发挥
the war
积极作用，
and for the
而不是继续的
restoration of
加剧
peace
冲突升级，
instead. Rather
挑动
than
阵营对
continuing
抗，
to escalate the
破坏
tensions,
国际
provoking
团结。
camp-based confrontations and sabotaging international peace and
中方愿
solidarity.
继续从
Going
有关各
forward,
方
China
保
will
持接触，
continue to stay in
沟通，
engagement and communication
为
with
推
all
动政治
relevant
解决危
parties
机
to
做出
work
不懈努力，
relentlessly towards a political
发挥
settlement of the
建设
crisis
性的作用。
and play a constructive role in this
谢谢主
process.
席。
I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this briefing, and I also thank USG DiCarlo for a briefing. The conflict in Ukraine has been ongoing for nearly 2.5 years, with a continuously deteriorating humanitarian and security situation, resulting in massive loss of lives and destruction of critical infrastructure. On the political situation, we note that between the 15th and 17th March 2024, elections are conducted in the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine, which are unilaterally being declared as part of the Russian Federation on 29 September 2022, after the reported conduct of referenda between 23rd and 27th September 2022. With respect to the reported referenda, Sierra Leone recalls that in March 2024, United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution ES 11/4 on October 12, 2022, which noted that the, quote, Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine are areas that in part are or have been under the temporary military control of the Russian Federation as a result of aggression in violation of the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, end of quote. We also take note of previous UNGA resolution, including 68/262, which also addressed a referendum conducted on 16 March 2014 in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, and the call for non-recognition of any alteration of their status on the basis of the referendum. Accordingly, we express serious concern regarding the decision to hold external electoral exercise in the annexed regions within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders, noting that such actions are not in tandem with the provisions of the UN Charter, in particular Article 2, Paragraph 4, and has serious implications on the peaceful resolution of the conflict in Ukraine. In this context, we also recall Security Council Resolution 2202, reaffirming its full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Premised on the above, Sierra Leone agrees and aligns itself with UN Secretary General's instructive statement of 29 September 2022, in which he recalls that any annexation of a state's territory by another state resulting from the threat or use of force is a violation of the principles of the UN Charter and international law. Mr. President, while we note the pronouncement of the parties to the conflict of their readiness to dialogue, it is clear that for genuine peace to be achieved, the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine has to be respected. In view of the above, it is imperative that direct engagement between both parties take place sooner than later. A military solution to the conflict in Ukraine is clearly not feasible. As we navigate the complexities of the conflict in Ukraine and its multidimensional global repercussions, we reiterate that the conflict has strained global political and economic relations and heightened geopolitical tensions with serious implications for international cooperation on critical socio-economic and developmental issues, in addition to the maintenance of international peace and security. The erosion of trust and cooperation between nations has also led to a breakdown in negotiations on critical global issues such as arms control, nuclear non-proliferation, cybersecurity, and trade agreements, posing additional challenges for the maintenance of international peace and security. Sierra Leone once more called for good faith diplomatic efforts in pursuit of a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Meaningful steps must be taken towards immediate cessation of the hostilities and parties to the conflict to engage constructively, including on their legitimate concerns, to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. It is important that we also continue to highlight the devastating effects of this conflict on civilians and civilian infrastructure. We reiterate OCHA reports indicating that 14.6 million people, about 40% of Ukraine's population, need some form of humanitarian assistance, while approximately 9.7 million people have been forcibly displaced by the war. The alarming civilian casualty figures and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine also underscores the urgent need for all parties to the conflict to prioritize the protection of civilians, dialogue and diplomacy, and refrain from further escalation and the pursuit of option of winning the conflict on the battlefield. The international community, including this Council, must remain steadfast in its commitment to supporting the pursuit of a just and sustainable peace in Ukraine. Let me close, Mr. President, by importantly noting that based on our unwavering principled view on the sacrosanct nature of the UN Charter principles on respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of member states, we once more reiterate our call for the full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, for her presentation of the situation today. I acknowledge the presence of the permanent representative of Ukraine at this meeting. Mr. President, considering the numerous occasions the Council has addressed the conflict between Russian Federation and Ukraine, I will focus today's statement on several positions and arguments we have consistently laid out. First, we remain highly concerned by the dangerous escalatory and trajectory of this conflict, including the risk of nuclear fallout by intent, miscalculation, or accident, as well as the real possibility of the conflict to engulf Europe in an all-out military confrontation. Second, dialogue, diplomacy, and détente remains the only viable path to de-escalation, cessation of hostilities, and eventual settlement. In this context, we take note of the joint communiqué on a peace framework from the recently concluded Summit on Peace in Ukraine, held in Switzerland on 15th and 16th June 2024. We appeal to the warring parties, allies, and foes alike to put aside their differences and play a constructive role toward a sustainable resolution of the conflict that considers the legitimate concerns of all involved. The longer the war continues, the further the prospect of a lasting peace recedes. Third, as civilians continue to bear the brunt of this war, we call on all parties to strictly adhere to international humanitarian law and the rules of war. The protection of civilians and those coming to their aid is imperative. The principle of distinction, precaution, and proportionality must be scrupulously respected by all parties. Fourth, we emphasize the respecting the UN Charter as the ultimate arbiter of international peace and security. As we mark the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, we must not allow the erosion of the frameworks painstakingly built by the international community that ensure peace and protect human dignity. Finally, we encourage the warring parties to build upon the few existing confidence-building measures, such as the exchange of prisoners, the return of fallen soldiers, addressing humanitarian issues, and engage communities in faith-based dialogue as steps toward returning to the negotiating table. Coming from a continent striving to silence the guns, Mozambique abides by the axiom that, and I quote, "Nothing is more valuable, human, and wise than peace among nations," end of quote. The Council must thus persevere in helping both parties regain hope for peace. We reiterate our call to immediately cease hostilities, resume direct negotiations without any preconditions, and engage in constructive and meaningful dialogue. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and I thank USG DiCarlo for your briefing. It's now over 2 years since Russia launched its illegal and unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. The consequences of Putin's war have been disastrous. In Kyiv last December, I met children learning to walk again, having lost limbs in Russian attacks. I met 2 young girls rescued after months of forced abduction by Russia. We mourn for over 10,000 civilians who've lost their lives in Ukraine. We share the concerns of parents of the 20,000 children forcibly removed and still untraced, displaced from their families. The people of Russia, in particular soldiers' mothers, suffer too. But not, of course, the Russian government, whose war chest is funded by their partners' oil and gas purchases, which in turn allows Russia to purchase weapons from DPRK and Iran, while their citizens and millions of people across the world face economic hardship and food insecurity. There is a peaceful way to end this war and this suffering. Last weekend in Switzerland, 100 countries and institutions met to discuss peace and an end to the war based on international law, the UN Charter principles, and President Zelensky's own proposals. And I thank the Swiss government for organising this conference. From every continent, representatives emphasised that all states benefit if there is respect for the UN Charter, for territorial integrity and sovereignty. It showed too how we could take the first steps towards peace now, including on food security, nuclear safety, and the return of Ukrainian children. But Putin spurned this opportunity. He dismissed the peace summit. He actively sought to undermine it. He spent the days leading up to the summit launching a vicious new assault on Kharkiv, using glide bombs to target civilians and to inflict further damage on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. He made clear that he's interested only in Ukraine's total capitulation. He suggested a ceasefire could be considered only if Ukraine ceded its sovereign territory to him. Where is peaceful settlement and respect for the UN Charter in that? And now, just 2 days after widespread international calls for a just peace in Ukraine, Putin has gone to Pyongyang to seek yet more North Korean weapons to sustain his war, in violation of Security Council resolutions. Every member of the United Nations has a responsibility to reject this and to uphold the principles of this institution. We must all urge Russia, the one state which can end this war immediately, to withdraw its forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine and engage constructively with international efforts to achieve a just and lasting peace in line with the principles of the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie Madame Di Carlo pour son exposé. La France salue la tenue de la conférence de haut niveau pour la paix en Ukraine qui s'est tenue le week-end dernier à Bürgenstock. Une centaine de pays se sont réunis pour définir ensemble les fondements de ce que doit être une paix juste et durable. La communauté internationale a pu ainsi travailler à des solutions concrètes en matière de sécurité et de sûreté nucléaire, de sécurité alimentaire et de protection des civils. Pendant que nous étions réunis pour rechercher un chemin vers la paix et faire face aux conséquences de la guerre d'agression conduite par la Russie, celle-ci a intensifié ses frappes contre le territoire ukrainien en ciblant délibérément les civils et en bafouant les droits des prisonniers de guerre. Les violations massives des droits de l'homme commises par la Russie en Ukraine sont documentées. Des cas de déportation et d'enlèvement d'enfants ukrainiens ont été vérifiés par les Nations Unies. La commission d'enquête a établi que le recours aux violences sexuelles par l'armée russe relevait d'une politique systématique. Monsieur le Président, la Russie n'a cessé de dénigrer le sommet pour la paix qui vient de s'achever et dissuader les pays qui étaient invités d'y participer. Nous l'avons entendu dénoncer dénoncé la prétendue partialité de l'initiative en présentant ce dialogue comme une tentative d'ultimatum à son égard. Elle qui, à la veille de l'ouverture de la conférence, a fixé comme condition à des pourparlers la reddition pure et simple de l'Ukraine. Les actes de la Russie montre qu'elle ne souhaite pas négocier de bonne foi et qu'elle assimile la paix à une capitulation de l'Ukraine. Notre responsabilité collective est d'appeler la Russie à cesser son agression, à revenir au respect du droit international et à rejoindre le cadre de discussion qui a été inauguré à Bürgenstock. Les appels à la paix ne peuvent être tournés que vers la Russie. C'est elle seule qui, décidant chaque jour de continuer sa guerre, porte atteinte à la paix et à la sécurité internationale. Monsieur le Président, la paix ne peut être la capitulation de l'agressé. Les négociations de paix ne sont possibles que si elles se fondent sur le droit international. Elles ne peuvent consister à prendre acte de l'agression d'un État souverain, de la violation de ses frontières internationalement reconnues et de la banalisation du recours illégal à la force. Ce serait la reconnaissance de l'état de fait, de la loi du plus fort et la fin du droit international. Le chemin que la communauté internationale a dessiné à Bürgenstock est celui de la paix aux frontières de l'Ukraine et de la Russie. C'est celui du droit international. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank USG De Carlo for her briefing. The ongoing war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine continues to cause large-scale human suffering and destruction with wide-ranging consequences across the globe. The Summit on Peace hosted by Switzerland last weekend brought together 100 countries and organizations from around the world. This robust participation demonstrates the willingness of the international community to achieve a lasting peace in Ukraine, based on the core principles of the UN Charter and in respect of international law. The international community once again unequivocally reiterated its condemnation of the use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of any state. These are the principles that must continue to serve as our guiding light as we seek a lasting solution to this illegal war. President, this is just the start of the process, and it is on us, as members of the international community, to move forward. An impasse in our peace efforts would perpetuate instability and jeopardize global food security and economic stability. The summit's thematic sessions opened avenues for possible engagement in the crucial areas of food security, freedom of navigation on the Black Sea, nuclear safety and security, as well as the exchange of prisoners of war and the return of the many thousands of Ukrainian children. We deeply regret Russia's narrative around the Peace Summit, which attempts to legitimize its aggression and obstructs the creation of a common understanding of a possible path for peace. Russia's war has also caused one of the fastest forced population movements since the Second World War. Close to 6 million Ukrainians are still living as refugees across Europe, and another 4.9 million are internally displaced. While Ukraine is fighting a war of necessity, defending its very right to exist, Russia continues to inflict suffering and damage. The recent offensive against the Kharkiv region has caused unmeasurable suffering to civilians and made their homes uninhabitable. Attacks against populated areas, targeting civilians and wrecking energy infrastructure, schools, and other civilian facilities are indefensible. President, the impact of the war extends far beyond Ukraine. Russia's decision to terminate the Black Sea Grain Initiative has severely impacted the production and export of agricultural products. Food security must not be weaponized in any way. Neither can we forget about the environmental consequences of constant shelling and remnants of war. Furthermore, The Russian Federation's illegal seizure and militarization of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, the largest nuclear plant in Europe, has threatened nuclear safety and security across the continent. We urge the Russian Federation to withdraw from the site and return full control to the legitimate Ukrainian authorities. We stress once again that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is unacceptable. Russian forces and officials have deported thousands of Ukrainian civilians to Russia, including children who have been forcibly separated from their families. The impact on children continues to be disproportionate, as verified by the UN in the latest annual report on children and armed conflict. In 2023, children continued to be killed and maimed and abducted. Schools and hospitals were attacked, and humanitarian access was denied. We call on Russia to swiftly adopt and implement an action plan to end and prevent such grave violations. All deported and unlawfully displaced Ukrainian children and all other Ukrainian civilians who were unlawfully detained must be returned to Ukraine. Furthermore, accountability for the most serious crimes under international law committed against and on the territory of Ukraine must be ensured. To conclude, President, we believe that reaching peace requires the involvement of and dialogue between all parties. We continue to support Ukraine until a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace is achieved in line with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this meeting. And I'm also grateful to Slovenia and the United States for requesting it. I also thank USG DiCarlo for her comprehensive briefing. This meeting is particularly timely after the peace summit on Ukraine over the weekend, for which Japan deeply appreciates Switzerland for hosting this important leaders' meeting. At the summit, we reiterated the international community's commitment towards achieving a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. An overwhelming majority of the world has been seeking peace in Ukraine since the start of Russia's aggression against Ukraine in violation of the Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. As reported by the United Nations, civilian casualties, including women and children, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure have continued to increase. We have time and again expressed our grave concern that Ukraine today may be elsewhere in the world, including East Asia tomorrow. To uphold the fundamental principles of international law and to prevent any future attempts to change the status quo by force anywhere in the world, it is essential that peace in Ukraine be achieved based on the UN Charter. Therefore, Japan once again recalled overwhelming majority of the member states have confirmed the importance of the Charter for just and lasting peace in Ukraine through General Assembly resolutions. In relation to East Asia, we also condemn the use of missiles and other military equipment from North Korea in flagrant violation of the related Security Council resolutions on non-proliferation. No country should fear their own sovereignty and territorial integrity would be threatened, and no country must not depart from the UN Charter and the Security Council resolutions. Mr. President, last week, Japanese Prime Minister Kishida and Ukraine President Zelensky signed the Japanese-Ukraine Support and Cooperation Accord. This clarifies the area of cooperation between two countries, including security and defense, humanitarian assistance, and recovery and reconstruction. We signed this accord based on the conviction the issue of Ukraine is an issue for the entire international community. What needs to be done is crystal clear. To restore Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity based on the UN Charter, Russia must withdraw unconditionally and immediately from Ukraine. We will continue to urge Russia to do so. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. My thanks also go to Rosemary DiCarlo for her insightful briefing. Mr. President, there are no reason whatsoever that could justify the damages caused by conflicts, including the killing of civilians, the suffering of refugees and internally displaced persons, and other harms affecting civilian population. Algeria remains concerned by the deterioration of the humanitarian situation resulting from the conflict in Ukraine and the impact of the ongoing hostilities on civilians and civilian infrastructure. The party should continuously endeavor to protect civilian and civilian infrastructure, including critical energy infrastructures. They also have to constantly comply with their obligation under international law, including international humanitarian law, and to refrain from any action that could endanger civilian and civilian infrastructure. Moreover, the party of the conflict need more than ever to hold back the escalation trend and to give inclusive dialogue the chance it deserves to achieve a peaceful solution. To bring back peace and security in Ukraine and in the region at large, there is no alternative to a peaceful settlement of this conflict. Such a settlement can only be achieved through an inclusive and constructive dialogue involving both parties to this conflict. It has also to be based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter that no one can question and the legitimate Security Council of both parties. Escalations may only result in more tensions and more casualties and losses, as it takes us away from any prospect for sustainable peace and so those polarizations. It is imperative for the Security Council to stay focused on how to resolve this conflict by tackling the most important urgent question merely: how to immediately stop the loss of lives and destruction of civilian infrastructures, and how to end the hostilities and maintain peace and security, how to achieve a just and lasting solution to this conflict. This should direct our compass. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG DiCarlo for the briefing and also welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Ukraine in today's meeting. Guyana takes note of the intensified diplomatic efforts being made this month, including the Peace Summit in Switzerland, to respond to the humanitarian and security situation in Ukraine and to find a peaceful and enduring resolution to the ongoing conflict. We hope that a path to enduring peace will soon be found, with the firm commitment of both parties and the support of the international community. Mr. President, Guyana remains deeply concerned about the devastating impact of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. We deplore the mounting civilian casualties sustained in this war and see the risk of a major catastrophe growing exponentially with each passing day. The illegal invasion of Ukraine has already caused untold loss and destruction of life and property and has led to a humanitarian and refugee crisis that is considered to be the largest and fastest displacement crisis in Europe since World War II. The war has also had a detrimental impact on energy, nuclear security and safety, the environment, and global food security, and is yet to show any signs of ending. We stress the need to immediately end the hostilities and for the Russian Federation to withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. Prolonging this war any further will only increase the already dire consequences for the civilian population and global peace and security. As member states of the United Nations,
We demand that the parties fully comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. This also includes the obligation to take constant care to prevent any harm to the civilian population and civilian objects, and to grant safe and unhindered access to OHCHR and humanitarian workers, including to areas under occupation. Guyana has been clear and consistent in reaffirming full respect for the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. We therefore reiterate that the principles of respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-interference in the internal affairs of another sovereign state, the prohibition on the threat or use of force, and the peaceful resolution of all disputes must be adhered to by all nations. We commend the ongoing efforts of neighboring and friendly states to provide humanitarian support to Ukraine, including to Ukrainian refugees trapped overseas, and call for increased support for the humanitarian needs and response plan. We also encourage further intensification of diplomatic dialogue with the parties to de-escalate hostilities and work towards sustainable peace. With this in mind, we look forward to the follow-up to the Peace Summit held in Switzerland and other positive initiatives that could bring reprieve to those suffering from the daily assault of weapons in Ukraine and Russia. Guyana once again urges this Council to work together to pave the path toward peace and to put an end to the suffering in Ukraine. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you.
Agradezco a la secretaria general
I'm
adjunta,
grateful to
Rosemary
the
DiCarlo,
Undersecretary
por su
General
detallada
Rosemary
exposición
DiCarlo for her
informativa.
detailed briefing.
El Ecuador lamenta que luego de más de
Ecuador
2 años de
regrets
iniciada
that
la invasión a Ucrania,
after 2
aún no
years
se
since
vislumbra
the
el final
invasion
del
of Ukraine,
conflicto.
there is still no
Por el contrario,
sign of the end of the
las
conflict. On the
hostilidades y
contrary,
los riesgos de
the
escalada se
hostilities and
intensifican,
risks of escalation
exacerbando
are
la tensa situación
increasing,
geopolítica
exacerbating the
y
tense
aumentando el
geopolitical
riesgo de una
situation and
confrontación más
increasing the
amplia.
risks of a broader
El Ecuador
confrontation.
lamenta que la
Ecuador
naturaleza
regrets the
prolongada
fact that the prolonged
del conflicto
nature of the
sigue
conflict
imponiendo un
continues
alto
to exact
costo
a
a
high
Ucrania y a su
price
gente,
for Ukraine and its people,
afectando desproporcionadamente a la población
disproportionately
civil.
affecting civilians.
La gravedad de la situación
The
humanitaria en
seriousness
Ucrania
of the humanitarian
es
situation in Ukraine
inconmensurable.
is immeasurable.
De la misma forma,
Likewise,
la guerra continúa
the war
generando repercusiones
continues to
negativas a
have
nivel global.
negative repercussions at a global level.
Los conflictos armados
Armed
tienden a desviar la
conflicts tend to
atención
divert
de los fondos
attention and
necesarios
funds
para abordar los
which are
desafíos globales
necessary to
urgentes,
address urgent global
afectando
challenges, and
especialmente a los
this
países en
affects
desarrollo.
developing countries in particular.
El Ecuador se
Ecuador
une al llamado
echoes
internacional
the
generalizado
widespread
para
international
que
call
todas las partes se
for all
abstengan de
parties
utilizar
to
armas
abstain
explosivas
from
en áreas
using
pobladas y alejen los
explosive
combates
weapons
de las zonas
in
urbanas.
populated areas and to
El
distance
derecho
themselves
internacional
from urban
humanitario
zones.
es claro en su
International
prohibición de los
humanitarian law
ataques
is
contra
clear
civiles
in
e
prohibiting
infraestructura
attacks
civil
against civilians and
y debe
civilian
ser
infrastructure
respetado.
and must be upheld.
De la misma forma, insisto en la necesidad
Likewise,
de
I
que se
stress the
respeten los
need
marcos
for
legales
upholding
internacionales
international legal
que rigen la
frameworks which
transferencia de
govern the
armas y
transfer of
municiones,
arms and
a fin
ammunition,
de contrarrestar las
so as to
amenazas que
counter the threats
representan
posed
el
by
flujo
the
masivo de
massive
armas y
flows of
municiones
arms
en el contexto
and
del conflicto.
ammunition in conflict
En materia de seguridad
contexts.
nuclear,
In terms of
el Ecuador
nuclear
reitera la necesidad de que se
security,
protejan
Ecuador
todas
reiterates
las
the need
instalaciones
to
nucleares en
protect
Ucrania,
all nuclear facilities in
incluyendo
Ukraine,
las centrales
including the
Zaporilla,
Zaporizhia
a través
power
del
plant,
cumplimiento de los 7 pilares de
by
seguridad nuclear
upholding the
y
7
los
pillars
5
for
principios
nuclear security and the 5 fundamental
fundamentales delineados por la
principles
OIEA.
laid out by the IAEA.
Toda narrativa o acción
Any
que
narrative
implique
or
una amenaza
action which
nuclear
involves a
es
nuclear
inaceptable.
threat is unacceptable.
La posición histórica del Ecuador es
The
clara
historic
sobre este
position
tema.
of Ecuador is
No
clear
existen buenas
here.
manos para las
There
armas
are no
nucleares.
right hands for nuclear
Señor
weapons.
presidente, después de haber
President,
entrado en el tercer
since
año
the
del conflicto,
conflict moved into
el
its
Ecuador
third
mantiene su
year,
posición de
Ecuador has
respaldo
maintained its
irrestricto a los principios
stance
de
of
integridad
an
territorial,
unreserved support for the
soberanía
principles of
e independencia política
territorial
de
integrity,
Ucrania,
sovereignty,
al
and the
tiempo que
political
aboga por una salida
independence of
pacífica y
Ukraine,
negociada del
whilst
conflicto.
calling for a peaceful
La posición de mi
negotiated
país
outcome to the conflict.
se basa en el
My
respeto a los
country's
principios
position
del
is
derecho
based upon
internacional,
respect for the principles
en
of
su
international
compromiso con
law
los principios
and our
establecidos en la
commitment to the
Carta,
principles established in the
especialmente
Charter,
aquellos delineados en su
particularly
artículo
those
2,
laid out in
y
Article
cuyo
2,
párrafo cuarto establece que
whose
los miembros de
fourth
la
paragraph
organización
establishes that members of the
deben
organization
abstenerse de
must
recurrir a la
abstain from the
amenaza
threat or
o al
use
uso de la fuerza
of
contra la
force
integridad o independencia política de
against
cualquier
the
Estado.
integrity or political independence of any
Por eso
state.
que el Ecuador sumó
This
su
is
voz
why
a la
Ecuador
amplia
added its
mayoría
voice
de
to
la
the vast
comunidad
majority of the
internacional
international
y
community
votó a favor de
and
las 6
voted in
resoluciones
favor of the
adoptadas
6
por la Asamblea
resolutions
General
adopted by the
en
General
el marco
Assembly
de su 11º periodo
as
extraordinario de
part of
sesiones
its
de
11th
emergencia
emergency
convocado
special
por este
session
propio
convened
Consejo
by this Council
mediante la resolución 26
through Resolution
2623.
2623.
En esa lógica, el Ecuador llama a la Federación Rusa
Following the same logic,
a que
Ecuador
cumpla con
calls
lo
upon the Russian
dictaminado por la
Federation
Corte
to
Internacional de
comply
Justicia en
with the
marzo del
order of the
2022
International Court of
y que
Justice in March
suspenda sus
2022
operaciones
and to
militares en
suspend
Ucrania
its military operations
para
in
dar paso al
Ukraine,
diálogo,
to open the
a la
way to
diplomacia,
dialogue and
como vías
diplomacy
legítimas
as
y
legitimate
efectivas
and
para la
effective
búsqueda de la paz.
paths in seeking peace.
En mayo del
In
2022,
May
este
2022,
Consejo
this
acordó la
Council
declaración de presidencia con la cual se recordó
adopted
que,
the presidential
en virtud
statement
de la
where it
Carta,
recalled that pursuant
todos
to the
los Estados
Charter,
miembros
as
asumimos
member
la
states, we
obligación de
all
arreglar
assume the
nuestras controversias
obligation of
internacionales
resolving our
por medios
international
pacíficos.
disputes by peaceful means.
También se expresó
It
apoyo a los
also
esfuerzos del
expressed
secretario
support
general
for the
en la
efforts of the
búsqueda de una
Secretary
solución
General in
pacífica,
seeking a peaceful
por lo que la presencia de la
resolution,
subsecretaria
and we
general Di
understand
Carlo
the
en la
Undersecretary
cumbre de
General
Suiza
Di
la
Carlo's
entendemos
presence
en ese
in the
marco.
Swiss
Señor Presidencia,
summit in this context.
Presidente, Excelencias,
President,
colegas,
colleagues,
ante el
excellencies,
incremento de
in
tensiones,
the light of the
resulta
increase in tension, it
crucial
is crucial
que se retome
to
la
resume
negociación y la vía
negotiations
diplomática,
and the path of
enmarcadas
diplomacy,
en la lógica de la
which
Carta de las
fall within
Naciones
the
Unidas
logic of the Charter of the United
y guiadas
Nations
por los
and are
principios de
guided by the
justicia
principles
establecidos
of
por la
justice
Asamblea
as
General,
established by the General Assembly,
respetando lo dispuesto
whilst
por la Corte
abiding by
Internacional
the
de
provisions of
Justicia.
the International Court of Justice.
El Ecuador insta a este Consejo
Ecuador
a que cumpla
urges
con
this
su
council to
responsabilidad
fulfill
primordial
its primary
de mantener la
responsibility
paz
of
y la seguridad
maintaining international
internacionales
peace and security,
y que actúe con determinación
and to
en
act
plena
with
adherencia a
determination,
los
fully in
principios de la Carta
compliance
de
with
las
the
Naciones
principles of the
Unidas
Charter of the United
para poner
Nations, so as to
fin a
bring
este
an end
conflicto
to this
devastador.
devastating
Es
conflict.
nuestro deber trabajar
It is our duty
para
to
encontrar una
work
paz justa y duradera en
seek
Ucrania,
just
que
and
respete su
lasting peace in
independencia,
Ukraine,
soberanía,
which
integridad
respects
territorial
its independence,
y que
sovereignty,
contemple
and
las
territorial integrity,
posiciones
and which
de
takes
todas las
account of
partes
all
involucradas.
of the views of
Muchas
all
gracias.
parties involved. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
President,
хотел бы в начале
I would like to
выступления
start my
отфиксировать для
statement
протокола,
by stating for the
и мы уже
record,
неоднократно
and we have
говорили
said
об
this on
этом,
many occasions,
отфиксировать наше
how
принципиальное
we
несогласие с
disagree on
приглашением на
principle with
сегодняшнее
invitation
заседание
to today's
8
meeting,
делегаций
8
по
delegations
правилам
under
процедуры
rule
37 и
of
39.
37 and 39.
Это количество явно не
This
соответствует
quantity
заявленному формату
clearly does not
дискуссии.
correspond to the
Ведь в
format of
программе
our
фигурирует
discussions,
брифинг, а
because
не
on the
дебаты или
program we have a
открытые дебаты.
briefing and not a debate or an open debate.
Сожалеем, что
We regret
южнокорейское
that the South Korean
председательство идет на подрыв
presidency
практики
is
работы
breaking with
Совета.
practice of the work of the Council.
Какую добавленную
What
стоимость все
added
эти
value
делегации
can
могут
all of
внести
these
в сегодняшнюю
delegations bring
дискуссию,
to today's discussions
если
if
6 из них
6 of
являются
them
одновременно
are at the
членами
same time
ЕС и
both
НАТО,
members of the
и
EU
ничего
and
за
NATO,
рамками
and they cannot
общеевропейской и
say anything
общенатовской позиции
different from
сказать
the
не могут?
EU and NATO position.
Очевидно, что нулевое.
Clearly, no added value.
Единственная цель
The
их
only
участия
aim of their
создать
participation
массовку,
is to create
хор
a
голосов
mass,
для
a
продвижения
chorus of
одних и тех же
voices to promote the
политизированных
same
установок Брюсселя.
politicized Brussels
Это
ideas.
очевидная
This
пустая
is a
трата
clear
ценных
waste of
ресурсов
the valuable
Совета.
resources of the Council.
Мы уже
We
неоднократно
have said
говорили
this
о
on many occasions.
контрпродуктивности
It is
такого подхода, который
counterproductive.
подрывает
It
авторитет
undermines the
ОСБ.
authority of the Security Council.
Отмечаем, что
We
после
note that
полугода
following
отсутствия на
half a year's
заседании Совета
absence of Security
Безопасности,
Council
сегодня на него
meetings,
запросился
today
постоянный
the permanent
представитель
representative of
Чехии.
Czechia will take part.
Напомню, в
I
декабре
recall that in
прошлого года он
December
наотрез
last year
отказался
he
появляться в
flat out
Совете,
refused
когда тот собирался
come to
для
the
того,
Council when the
чтобы
Council
обсудить
met to discuss
террористические
the
удары
terrorist
ВСУ по
strikes of the
Белгороду,
UAF on
поставленные
Belgrade
Чехией СЗО «Вампайр». Рассчитываем, что сегодня мы наконец услышим от постоянного представителя Чехии исчерпывающее объяснение по поводу их соучастия в преступлениях киевского режима. Господин председатель, созыв сегодняшнего заседания Совета Безопасности ООН, западные коллеги формально мотивировали необходимостью обсудить политическую ситуацию на Украине. Правда, из выступлений делегаций почти ничего политического мы не вынесли. Или ничего нового, что бы мы могли услышать. Однако нам действительно есть что обсудить политически. Например, истечение 20 мая срока президентских полномочий Зеленского и возникающие в связи с этим многочисленные правовые и юридические нюансы. Все чаще проскальзывает в западных СМИ спекуляция о возможных преемниках. Кого и какой орган Украины сейчас рассматривает в качестве легитимного представителя? Кто с правовой точки зрения легитимен для участия в переговорах о мире на Украине? Это важный вопрос, но об этом никто не говорит. Разве кто-то из сегодняшних выступавших поднял вопрос о причинах конфликта, о продолжающихся масштабных притеснениях русскоязычного населения, насаждении безапелляционной русофобии, противоречащей Уставу ООН и Декларации о принципах международного права, касающихся дружественных отношений и сотрудничества между государствами в соответствии с Уставом ООН от 1970 года, где закреплено, что принцип уважения территориальной целостности применим к государствам, соблюдающим в своих действиях принцип равноправия и самоопределения народов, и вследствие этого имеющие правительство, представляющее весь народ, проживающий на данной территории. Никто, кроме нас, не говорит в Совете Безопасности о правах русскоязычных граждан, без учета мнений которых, согласно упомянутым документам, невозможна полная поддержка территориальной целостности страны. Сожалеем, что этот тезис не находит отражения и в выступлении секретариата. Мы слышали сегодня от британского представителя слова сочувствия мирным украинцам, За все это время, с 2014 года, когда киевский режим начал войну против своих собственных граждан на Донбассе, мы не слышали ни слова сочувствия детям Донбасса, которых беспощадно убивало ВСУ и нацбатальоны. А ведь мы проводили заседание Совета Безопасности и заседание по формуле Ария, где демонстрировали, какие травмы получали дети Донбасса от ударов ВСУ, и это помимо убитых украинцев. Где же тогда было ваше сострадание? Как нет его у вас и ваших западных партнеров, когда ВСУ целенаправленно бьет по мирному населению российских городов? Ваше избирательное сострадание не вызывает ничего, кроме отвращения. Как мы неоднократно говорили, мы начали СВО, чтобы прекратить и остановить резню, которую киевский режим устроил против населения Донбасса. Господин председатель, еще один вопрос. Говорили ли члены СБ, ратующие за обсуждение прав человека в Совете Безопасности при любом удобном случае, о судьбе Украинской Православной Церкви? Нет, не говорили. Однако в наши дни, при полном молчании со стороны международных организаций, разрушаются православные храмы, а священники канонической Украинской Православной Церкви подвергаются гонениям по политическим мотивам. По статистике, которой бравирует Служба безопасности Украины, по состоянию на декабрь 2023 года возбуждено более 70 уголовных дел против священнослужителей УПЦ, 16 из которых митрополит. В отношении 19 из них вынесены обвинительные приговоры. Буквально месяц назад, несмотря на массовые протесты, по указанию киевских властей, вопреки протестам общественности, снесена часовня на месте древнейшей десятинной церкви. На данный момент киевский режим нацелен исключительно на обслуживание геополитических интересов Запада, поскольку только это гарантирует ему политическое выживание. Социально-экономическая ситуация для нынешних властей в Киеве сейчас не важна, поскольку они временщики. Однако и она стремительно деградирует. Люди массово бегут с Украины за границу, спасаясь от развернутой киевским режимом мобилизации, которую в стране прозвали мобилизацией. Они не желают пополнять ряды, обреченного на верную гибель пушечного мяса. Только по официальным данным Украина уже покинула порядка 6 миллионов человек. Буквально вчера появилась информация о том, что в Германию в полном составе сбежал Киевский симфонический оркестр. Нередки случаи Аналогичные случаи среди спортсменов. Процветает коррупция, гуманитарная помощь восхищается, СМИ действуют жесточайшая цензура. Цены на продукты питания и тарифы на жилищные и коммунальные услуги повысились в десятки раз, что поставило простой народ на грани выживания. Среди украинского населения растет возмущение происходящего. Согласно данным Киевского международного института социологии, большинство украинцев видит причину ухудшения экономической ситуации, деградирующее положение дел с демократией в действиях властей. Одновременно члены НАТО во главе США в лучших неоколониальных традициях фактически занимаются разграблением Украины, за бесценок скупая ее ресурсные, промышленные и сельскохозяйственные мощности. Отъявленный русофоб сенатор Линдси Грэм недавно открыто заявил, что Киев, цитирую, «сидит на критически важных полезных ископаемых стоимостью 10-12 триллионов долларов. Я не хочу отдавать эти деньги и активы Путину, чтобы он поделился с Китаем. Эти минеральные активы могут быть освоены Украиной и Западом». Конец цитаты. Примечательно, что Запад, беспокоящийся за возврат вложенных в конфликт на Украине средств, все больше говорит о кредитах, которые украинцам придется возвращать. Интересно, знает ли об этом сами украинцы? Господин председатель, сегодня мы не услышали про все эти неудобные вопросы для Киева и западных спонсоров. Сюжеты о политической ситуации ни слова. Ведь они созвали это заседание с единственной целью попытаться оживить мертвую ложь, псевдомирную и псевдоглобальную конференцию в Бюргеншток. Для любого здравомыслящего наблюдателя было с самого начала очевидно, что она обречена на провал. Ведь ее организаторы и вдохновители думали обо всем, что угодно, но точно не о мире. Да и о каком мире может идти речь, если единственной целью сходки было собрать массовку для того, чтобы выдвинуть России ультиматум якобы от лица международного сообщества. Но лукавым чаяниям тех, кто стоял за созывом Бюргенштока, не суждено сбыться. Во-первых, большинство приглашенных раскусило эту примитивную интригу и отказалось в ней участвовать. Во-вторых, многие присутствующие высказались в ее ходе совсем не так, как планировали организаторы. В том числе они прямо сказали, что попытки что-либо обсуждать без России бессмысленны. Видимо, с учетом этого, может быть, в силу внутриполитических причин, основные вдохновители сходки США, Германия, Франция и Япония покинули конференцию раньше, чем она завершилась. В итоге даже украинские представители были вынуждены признать, что подходы Запада и остального мира по украинскому кризису серьезно отличаются. Количество и география участников наглядно продемонстрировали, что выхлоп от нее получился нулевой. Никакого политического веса итоги всех этих встреч не имеют и не могут быть никакой отправной точкой для хоть сколько-то серьезного разговора о перспективах урегулирования украинского кризиса. Такие узкие междусобойчики могут собираться хоть десяток раз, однако мир они не приблизят. Сожалеем, что в этой сходке приняли участие представители секретариата ООН, лукаво назвав это участием в качестве наблюдателя. Это недопустимо в соответствии со статьей 100 Устава ООН. Господин председатель, президент Российской Федерации 14 июня озвучил реальное мирное предложение. Напомню, речь идет о нейтральном, неблоковом, безъядерном статусе Украины и ее демилитаризации, денацификации, признании новых территориальных реалий, статуса Крыма, Севастополя, Донецкой, Луганской народных республик, Херсонской и Запорожской областей как субъектов Российской Федерации. В дальнейшем все эти базовые принципиальные положения должны быть зафиксированы в виде фундаментальных международных договоренностей. Естественно, это предполагает и отмену всех западных санкций против России. Кроме того, с учетом сказанного нами ранее о системном попрании прав и свобод человека неонацистским режимом, при любом разговоре о перспективах урегулирования конфликта важно также учитывать, что Киев должен отменить свои законодательные акты и иные решения, носящие русофобский характер, в том числе запреты на русский язык во всех сферах жизни, навсегда отказаться от прославления нацизма. Необходимо заставить Украину вернуться в правовое поле, чтобы гарантировать права и свободы всего населения Украины, включая ту его часть, которая говорит на русском языке. Мы слышали, что руководство западных стран и НАТО поспешило это мирное предложение отвергнуть. Для нас это не стало сюрпризом. Эти отказы просто подтверждают стратегическую слепоту западных столиц. Нечто похожее мы наблюдали в конце 2021 года, когда США, НАТО и Европа отвергли предложенный Россией проект договоренности по гарантии безопасности. Призываем западный коллег не повторять своих ошибок и прислушаться к голосу разума. В противном случае политическая и моральная ответственность за продолжение кровопролития будет на них. Очевидно, что реалии на земле на линии боевого соприкосновения будут дальше меняться не в пользу киевского режима, и условия для начала переговоров будут другими. Российские предложения нацелены не на заморозку конфликта, а на его реальное завершение. Это позволит перевернуть эту трагическую страницу истории и постепенно, шаг за шагом, начать восстанавливать отношения доверия и добрососедства между Россией и Украиной и в целом Европой. Но для этого необходимы кардинальные изменения вектора мышления западных политических элит, их принципиальный отказ от попыток использования украинского проекта против России, отказ НАТО от агрессивной милитаристской политики, возвращение к нормальному обстоятельному диалогу по всему комплексу вопросов глобальной безопасности, при обязательном учете интересов всех государств. Это единственный путь для того, чтобы избежать дальнейшей эскалации. Призываем ему последовать, пока не поздно. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the Republic of Korea. I thank USC Rosemary DiCarlo for her timely briefing. Last weekend, around 100 delegations from various countries and institutions, including the Republic of Korea, convened in Switzerland for the first summit on peace in Ukraine. It is notable that leaders agreed on a common vision forward in the joint communique in the areas of nuclear safety, food security, and humanitarian issues. My delegation also notes that a variety of views on ways to end this war were exchanged during the summit, and we believe that this summit laid important groundwork toward achieving lasting peace in Ukraine. Also last week, a series of high-level conferences, including the G7 summit in Italy and the Ukraine Recovery Conference in Germany, demonstrated a shared sense of urgency for stopping this war. However, it is dismaying that Russia continued its attacks against Ukrainian cities, including Kyiv, with missiles and drones, even as global leaders were meeting last week. All wars eventually end, and so will the war in Ukraine. However, the way the war in Ukraine ends will largely determine the future of global politics and define the security architecture in Europe and beyond. As such, we stress three basic principles that must be upheld in ending the war in Ukraine. First, the UN Charter and international law should be the bedrock for all future talks, as also set out in the joint communique of the Summit on Peace in Ukraine. In particular, Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity must be respected. In this light, I urge Russia to recall the UN General Assembly resolutions adopted by the overwhelming majority of member states condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine and declaring that its annexation of Ukraine's territories have no validity under international law. Second, accountability should be thoroughly pursued in order to demonstrate our collective will to preserve humanity and squash impunity. We welcome the holding of the Ministerial Conference on restoring justice for Ukraine in the Netherlands last April, to take stock of the establishment of an accountability mechanism. In the same vein, we support ongoing efforts, including by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, established by UN Human Rights Council, to collect evidence of war crimes and other atrocities in Ukraine. Third, international assistance to Ukraine should be ramped up to show our resilience against armed aggression. As Ukraine is struggling to defend itself, against Russia's illegal invasion, it is clear which party should be supported. In this light, we will continue to support Ukraine and its people based on Ukraine Peace and Solidarity Initiative signed by our two leaders last year. In vivid contrast, supporting Russia's illegal invasion is both immoral and may even constitute a violation of Security Council resolutions, as in the case of illicit arms transactions between Russia and DPRK. In fact, at this very moment, Russia's President Putin is in Pyongyang at the invitation of the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. While carefully watching the first visit of the Russian president to DPRK in 24 years, we cannot help but be deeply worried that Moscow, having already destroyed the global CCTV monitoring DPRK sanctions violations, may further intensify its dangerous military deals in Pyongyang. Not only what Russia receives from this deal, but also what North Korea gets in return may pose a significant threat to international peace and security. Now that this illegal and perilous military cooperation between these two countries has emerged as a grave international security concern in Europe, Asia, and beyond, as demonstrated by the recent G7 leaders' condemnation of this act, it will be met with a resolute response from the international community. Colleagues, the Republic of Korea's modern history provides an eloquent example of the international community defending the spirit of the UN Charter and the Security Council playing its role against unprovoked armed aggression. Indeed, I am proud to say that my country is a model for the power of international cooperation and global solidarity. As such, we reiterate our strong commitment to standing alongside the Ukrainian people until they achieve a just and lasting peace in their lands. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council. I would like to thank Under-Secretary General DiCarlo for her briefing and participation in the high-level summit on peace for Ukraine as a representative of the UN Secretariat in the observer status. I also recognize the continued occupation of the seat of the Soviet Union by the dictator's envoy. His country was not present at the peace summit as it remains unwilling to give up the language of ultimatums and to accept and implement the language of international law and the UN Charter. The latter was the basis and the guiding principle for the representatives of 100 countries and international organizations from across the globe assembled in Switzerland past weekend. Almost two-thirds were represented at the highest level. The summit allowed each of the participants to demonstrate global leadership. Essentially, this event is the first step towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace based on the UN Charter and the core principles of international law. As follows from the joint communiqué on a peace framework, this summit was built on previous discussions that have taken place based on Ukraine's peace formula and other peace proposals which are in line with international law, including the UN Charter. During the summit, participants agreed on a common position on 3 points: food security, nuclear security, and the release of all captured and deported Ukrainians, adults and children, abducted by Russia. The key principles of these elements for a just and sustainable peace are set out in the joint communiqué on a peace framework. In this document, the summit participants emphasized that the use of nuclear energy and nuclear installations must be safe, secured, safeguarded, and environmentally sound, and that Ukrainian nuclear power plants and installations, including Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, must operate safely and securely under full sovereign control of Ukraine and under the supervision of the IAEA. The joint communiqué also contains a clause on the uninterrupted manufacturing and supply of food products. Attacks on merchant ships, civil ports, and civilian port infrastructure are unacceptable. The communiqué emphasizes that food security must not be weaponized in any way. Prisoners of war must be released through a full exchange, and all deported and illegally displaced Ukrainian children and civilians must be returned to Ukraine. President, since the early stages of preparation of the summit, we have been asked why Russia was not there. As we have already said, Russia prefers aggressive ultimatums to returning to the tenets of international law. Moreover, Russia labels as ultimatums our calls to implement the UN Charter and respect its principles. Our stance on attempts to appease the aggressor under current circumstances is clear and well known. Efforts at appeasement won't work now, just as they failed to work in the past, notably in 1938-1939. We remember well the efforts made then to prevent world war through appeasement. Democratic states took the unprecedented step of signing the Munich Agreement with the leaders of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Let us remember the hopeful headlines and articles from the international press on September the 30th, 1938, which stated, and I quote, "Never was a simpler document issued in history with consequences more far-reaching or more pregnant with hope. If the two men who issued it stick to their resolves, the peace of Europe seems assured for a generation at least." End of quote. The then British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain echoed these hopeful sentiments, declaring at the airport upon his return from Munich, and I quote, "I have returned from Germany with peace for our time." End of quote. Indeed, just like today, countries across the world did not want, and I quote Chamberlain again, "digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing." A faraway country, then it was Czechoslovakia, which was not in fact very far away. Leaders around the world did everything to appease Hitler by allowing him to annex the region of Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, the faraway country, in return for nothing more consequential than a promise that this would be his last territorial grab. This brings me to recall how in 2014 we were persuaded that the world did not want confrontation with Russia, and the temporary occupation and attempted annexation of territories of Ukraine, including Crimea, was the last territorial grab that Russia needed. The representative of Czechia will speak after me, and I'm sure he can confirm that the result of all attempts to appease the aggressor in 1938 was well known. The promise of military support for Czechoslovakia was withdrawn. The agreement was signed, and Czechoslovakia, which had mobilized 1.5 million soldiers and was ready to fight, was not even invited to the conference in Munich. Czechoslovakian representatives were only informed of the essence of the agreement. So was peace finally preserved? I don't think this chamber needs to be reminded of the ensuing developments. The Sudetenland was annexed. Less than 2 months later, the Kristallnacht occurred. 6 months after Munich, the whole of Czechoslovakia was occupied. And less than a year after Munich, World War II began. Churchill's warning made after the Munich conference came true. I quote, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You choose dishonor, and you will have war." End of quote. And as the US president, who had previously urged Hitler to seek a peaceful resolution, was now sending entirely different messages and saying that, I quote, "For too many years we lived on pious hopes that aggressor and warlike nations would learn and understand and carry out the doctrine of purely voluntary peace. The well-intentioned but ill-fated experiments of former years did not work," end of quote. And now let's recall how the Allies, who once wanted to prevent war through these well-intentioned but ill-fated experiments, came to final arrangements as to how the war should be ended. As soon as they learned the bitter lesson that appeasement and territorial sacrifices would not prevent bloodshed, they gathered for the first Inter-Allied Conference in London in June of 1941. This time, neither Hitler nor Mussolini were present at the conference. It is noteworthy that at this first conference, the Allies focused on three key topics, although the scope of critical issues to be addressed was much broader. Not only did the Allies pledge to assist one another in the war, but also they promised not to enter into any separate peace, and that there could be no peace until threat of Axis domination had passed. So as you see, we have been through all this before. Our predecessors tried appeasement. They tried territorial gifts. They rejoiced over signed papers with hollow promises from the aggressors. And then the world faced the atrocities of the war, with tens of millions dead, with genocide, with Holocaust, and with massive destruction of many near and faraway countries. Last Friday, in this chamber, the Russian briefer threatened us with a repetition of the Caribbean crisis, looking at the same time fully unaware of what party to conflict was a nuclear power and how the state uses its nuclear weapons to blackmail and to intimidate, including by transferring them to other countries. And it is worth recalling that the US President Kennedy said while explaining his decision to implement a quarantine, and I quote, "The 1930s taught us a clear lesson. Aggressive conduct, if allowed to grow unchecked and unchallenged, ultimately leads to war." A world leader's words which all aggressors today should be reminded of. President, between the first Allies Conference in June 1941 and the UN Conference on International Organization in San Francisco in April 1945, More than 24 other high-level conferences, including Tehran and Yalta, to name but two, were held, and again, neither Hitler nor Mussolini were among their participants. Over these years, not only were victories achieved on the battlefield, but a significant amount of work was also done at the negotiating table. And if this work had not been done, there would be no United Nations, no UN Charter, nor the Security Council. Therefore, it is essential that peace-loving nations continue their work on a peace framework. The summit in Switzerland has made a start on this work. We urge all those who have not yet joined the process to actively engage and contribute to the restoration of a just peace. We would like the proposals developed by other countries to be a part of a dialogue, rather than conveyed through media. Every country and every leader has the right to their own position without imposing it on others. We need to respect each other. Ukraine will never, and I repeat, never be an object of someone else's plans. It is not 1938, either here or outside this chamber. The joint communiqué of the summit in Switzerland has been open for joining by all UN member states. We call on all peace-loving nations to join the strong group of those member states and international organizations who have already supported this document, thus contributing to upholding the UN Charter and its principles, underlying a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace for Ukraine, as envisaged by the UN General Assembly resolution. As the President of Ukraine said at the summit, and I quote, "There is no need to reinvent the wheel when the UN Charter already defines the foundations of peace and normal coexistence of peoples. So we just have to return to them." A comprehensive, just, and lasting peace is all that Ukraine needs. And I'm convinced that this is our shared aspiration, and I encourage all of you to work together to make this vision a reality. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Czechia.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would like to thank USG DiCarlo for her briefing. Czechia aligns itself with the statement to be delivered by the European Union, and I would like to add a few remarks in my national capacity. As Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine continues to inflict widespread suffering on millions of civilians, destroying innocent lives and livelihoods, there is one country that wishes most to see a durable and just peace, and that country is Ukraine. In this regard, we welcome the success of the last week's Summit on Peace in expressing unequivocal support for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, based on the UN Charter and international law. At the largest and most representative global event since the beginning of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine in 2014, countries from all regions of the world represented at the highest political level sent a very clear message to the Russian aggressor. Any peace proposal that is not in line with the UN Charter, including the principle of territorial integrity, cannot be called a peace plan. At the same time, we sincerely regret that several countries with the ambition to play an active global role were not present at the summit or did not join the final declaration and its commitment to uphold international law. In line with the outcome of the summit, Czechia remains committed to supporting President Zelensky's peace formula, which is the only peace plan on the table that meets the requirements of being in accordance with international law and the UN Charter. We are ready to continue our active involvement in the peace formula process as a co-chair of the Working Group on Nuclear Safety and Security, a matter of great concern to us. As we speak, Russia's heavy shelling of Ukraine's civilian energy infrastructure persists. This targeted destruction of the energy grid not only has severe humanitarian consequences for the civilian population, but also places an immense strain on the nuclear power plants in Ukraine. To be clear, the erosion of nuclear safety and security is not only a problem for Ukraine or Europe. It has broad cross-regional implications. Should the situation escalate further and potentially lead to a real incident, it would jeopardize the future of peaceful nuclear installations worldwide. Our efforts to combat global warming by developing clean and sustainable energy sources would suffer a severe setback. Both developed and developing countries would be highly affected. This is a hazardous game, and we must all urge Russia to stop it immediately. Mr. President, Ukraine is under a brutal attack by the Russian Federation. The people of Ukraine continue their heroic defense of their nation, their land, and their values. The international community must take concrete steps to end the war and support Ukraine's sovereignty within its internationally recognized borders. Czechia is determined to work with all those who genuinely uphold the key principles of the UN Charter to make a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine a reality. Mr. President, let me briefly respond to the baseless accusations leveled against my country by the Russian representative today. And let me assure him that my country has no intention of participating in meetings organized by Russia that serve no purpose, especially since Russia, as the permanent member of the Security Council, is the aggressor. I would like to remind the Russian representative that Ukraine is merely exercising its legitimate right to defend itself against the Russian aggression and is doing so fully in line with the UN Charter and international law. My country's military support for Ukraine is legitimate under international law. Military assistance to a state that faces aggression is fully in line with the UN Charter. Ukraine has the right to regain full control of its territory within its internationally recognized borders. The export of military equipment is fully in line with the obligations under the relevant arms trade treaties. These norms prohibit exports towards an aggressor, not towards a state victim of an external aggression. With the support received from Czechia and others, Ukraine is defending its civilian population against the countless indiscriminate attacks by Russian armed forces. Russia's attacks have already caused thousands of deaths of innocent civilians. Let us remember that. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Czechia for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. We thank the United States and Slovenia for this timely meeting, and Switzerland for hosting a successful global summit on peace in Ukraine this past weekend. The significance of the summits cannot be overstated. More than 100 countries and international organizations participated, including numerous heads of state and government from across the globe. The summit reconfirmed widespread international support for a peace process based on international law, including the UN Charter, and conveyed strong political will to solve concrete challenges. And the summit sent a strong message. State borders cannot be redrawn by force. The UN Charter must be upheld. Sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity are non-negotiable. These are principles we all signed up for, and that are the keystones for all of us who believe in multilateralism and international law. They underpin the security of all of us. For this reason, and so many others, global support for Ukraine is of utmost importance for international peace and security, a shared responsibility for the entire international community. Mr. President, while more than 100 countries and international organizations met at the Peace Summit, Russia continued its assault on Ukraine and actively worked to undermine international efforts for peace. In the run-up to the summit, Russia committed some of its deadliest attacks against Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion. According to the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, the month of May was the deadliest in terms of civilian casualties since June 2023, with more than half of the casualties attributed to Russia's ongoing assault on Kharkiv. During the same period, we witnessed a surge of cyber attacks and disinformation efforts by Russia. The difference in political approach between a summit of peace in Switzerland and Russia's brutal actions in Ukraine is striking. Russia's so-called peace proposal, announced on the eve of the summits, lays bare the intentions of Moscow, which must be rejected, namely to subjugate Ukraine and deny Ukraine its right to sovereignty and territorial integrity. Mr. President, the Nordic countries condemn Russia's war and aggression against Ukraine. We are deeply concerned about reports that weapons are transferred from the DPRK and used by Russia in Ukraine. We urge all states to abide by their obligations under international law and relevant resolutions of the Security Council by refraining from providing material or other support that helps Russia to continue the illegal war. Ukraine is exercising its inherent right of self-defense in accordance with the UN Charter. Third countries have a right under international law to assist a state that is a victim of aggression. Yet, Russia cynically continues to call for meetings in the Council on these lawful weapons transfers to Ukraine. Russia's goal remains to subjugate Ukraine. In the areas that it has temporarily occupied, Russia has brought death, terror, and destruction, not peace. No one wants peace more than Ukraine, whose people continue to suffer the consequences of Russia's aggression. But it cannot be peace at any cost. Any future consultations must adhere to international law, the UN Charter, and its principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty. We sincerely hope for Russia's involvement in such future consultation of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace on that basis. In closing, the Nordics echo the repeated calls on Russia to cease all hostilities and withdraw their troops from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, to end the war and let peace prevail. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for their statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Hedda Samson, the Charge d'Affaires of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino, align themselves with this statement. Mr. President, I would like to commend the efforts of Switzerland in holding a successful summit on peace in Ukraine. I'd like to highlight 3 points. First, the summit reconfirmed the strong support for the UN Charter and for international law. Representatives from 100 countries from all continents and international organizations participated, a majority at the highest level. With broad participation and for the first time at the highest political level, the summit confirmed the need to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace for Ukraine, based on the UN Charter and international law. We welcome the joint communiqué adopted at the summit, which emphasized international law, including the UN Charter, and relevant United Nations General Assembly resolutions. The EU stands ready to support tangible steps for its follow-up. The summit also addressed more specific issues of vital interest to the whole world and committed to undertake concrete steps in the future, engaging partners globally, 1, to ensuring security and safety of nuclear installations in Ukraine, and recalling that any threat or use of nuclear weapons in the context of the ongoing war against Ukraine is inadmissible. 2, to ensuring food security and freedom of navigation. And 3, to facilitating the exchange of captives and ensuring the return of the many thousands of Ukrainian children to Ukraine. It's now up to Russia to show its readiness to make tangible progress and demonstrate with its actions a clear commitment to the UN Charter. Mr. President, on my second point, unfortunately, while we were discussing the way to peace in Ukraine, Russia continued its indiscriminate shelling on civilians and civilian infrastructure. Rolling blackouts are now affecting all regions of Ukraine, including the capital city of Kyiv. This leaves essential services and infrastructure without electricity for up to 12 hours a day. The UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions recently visited Ukraine to investigate the reported alarming scale and gravity of the violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law committed by Russia since the onset of its full-scale invasion in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and beyond. Thirdly, Russia and its leadership must be held accountable for waging a war of aggression against Ukraine and for other most serious crimes under international law, as well as for the massive damage caused by the war. The Children and Armed Conflict report this year again lists the Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups for killing and maiming, as well as for attacks on schools and hospitals. The EU has joined the International Coalition for the Return of Ukrainian Children. The EU is engaged in efforts to bring back home the Ukrainian children who were deported and forcibly transferred by Russia. Russia will be held accountable for these wrongful acts, which may amount to war crimes. Mr. President, in closing, let me reaffirm the EU's unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Let us be clear. While under aggression, Ukraine is trying to chart a path towards a just and sustainable peace. It seeks to defend international law and the UN Charter. Russia, on the other hand, doubles down on war and human suffering. It seeks to annex another state's sovereign territory. It seeks control over another independent state's domestic and foreign policies, all while continuing to violate international humanitarian law. The EU will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes and as intensely as needed. I thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Samson for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. We also align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. I also would like to thank Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. We meet today following the Summit on Peace in Ukraine, which took place in Switzerland and brought together peace-loving UN member states. We fully support Ukraine's peace formula as the only viable roadmap to achieving comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine based on international law and principles of the UN Charter. Any initiatives or plans coming from Kremlin or elsewhere, neglecting the core principles of the UN Charter, cannot be justified or supported. Such endeavors, if implemented, would inevitably undermine international law and not lead to comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. Our countries remain committed to working towards fulfillment of Ukraine's peace formula goals, laying the path for a durable and just peace. United Nations General Assembly resolution on principles of the UN Charter underlying a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine that was adopted in February 2023 with a majority of 141 votes sets the only viable way towards just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with the Charter, including the principles of sovereign equality and territorial integrity of states. This resolution also calls for an immediate cessation of the attacks on the critical infrastructure of Ukraine and any deliberate attacks on civilian objects, including those that are residential areas, schools and hospitals. Mr. President, as reaffirmed at the summit, the Baltic states are dedicated to upholding the efforts by the International Atomic Agency, ensuring full safety and security of nuclear infrastructure in Ukraine. Russia must immediately cease its military actions endangering nuclear safety and withdraw its military personnel and ammunition from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Ukraine should regain full control of all of its nuclear facilities. We also support measures ensuring safe and unimpeded transit of Ukrainian grain and produce to those in need in contribution to global food security. We condemn the Russian Federation, which along with other conventional means of warfare continues to use special ammunition equipped with hazardous chemical substances against Ukrainian armed forces. We urge the members of the Security Council to bring this issue into their deliberations to find an effective response from the international community to Russia's violation of international law and the provisions of the Chemical Weapons Convention. Furthermore, we call for Russia to abide by its international obligations and immediate release all illegally detained Ukrainians and return more than 20,000 Ukrainian children deported or illegally transferred to Russia. Particularly alarming is mobilization of boys into Russian army as soon as the age allows, which is in the violation of Geneva Convention. We should not tolerate Russia's war tactics, which include attacking schools and hospitals, killing and maiming of children, as well as deliberately denying them the humanitarian aid. For this, and rightly so, the Secretary General has listed Russia for the 2 years in a row in the annexes of the Secretary General Annual Children in Armed Conflicts Report as a party committing grave violation against children. Russia has not signed the Joint Action Plan with the UN to end and prevent grave violations against the children. There is also a growing body of evidence that Russia systematically subjects Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilians to killings, torture, and ill treatment, including severe beatings, rape, inhuman conditions of detention, and denial of medical support. Mr. President, Russia also is stepping up its hybrid activities against neighbors, particularly in the Baltic Sea region: arson attacks, GPS jamming, attacks against critical infrastructure, interference in the EU elections, physical violence, information manipulation attacks, instrumentalization of migration, and etc. Such Russia's actions are deliberate escalatory provocation to intimidate neighboring countries and their societies. Mr. President, international monitoring mechanisms, including the UN Commission of Inquiry, have concluded that Russian authorities have committed a wide range of violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law in Ukraine. The political and military leadership of Russia and its accomplice Belarus must be held accountable for the destruction of civilian, including energy infrastructure of Ukraine, its war crimes and other serious international crimes committed in Ukraine, including the crime of aggression. We also condemn Iran and the DPRK, who are complicit in Russia's indiscriminate war against Ukraine and killing of civilians by providing weapons and ammunition to Russia. Russia must compensate all the damage. The registry of damage is already functional. Furthermore, international compensation mechanism, which may include a claims commission and a compensation fund, will have to be established to cover all the losses of the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian people. Eventually, immobilized Russian assets should be used for this purpose in absence of voluntary compensation. The Baltic states reiterate our full commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We call again on Russia to unconditionally, completely, and immediately withdraw all its military forces and equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, Excellencies, thank you for organizing this especially timely meeting, and to Madam Undersecretary Rosemary DiCarlo for her insightful intervention. The just concluded Peace Summit in Switzerland, with the participation of over 100 countries and international organizations representing all continents, clearly showed overwhelming support for ending the hostilities being carried out by the Russian Federation in Ukraine. Once again, the international community spoke loudly and clearly that it remains committed to ending the conflict in a way that guarantees Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, and we will continue to do that until Russia's aggression is continued. President Andrzej Duda, who was one of those voices, stating at the summit, and I quote, "The peace agreement that will eventually be worked out has to ensure the sovereignty of Ukraine, its full practical capabilities to defend its independence, as well as free and unimpeded right to shape its internal and foreign policies without Russia's influence." End of quote. On the contrary, the approach to the peace process presented by Russia leaves no room for negotiations, and it's not really intended to achieve progress in the peace process, but rather serve as an impeded justification for the continuation of war. The peace terms proposed by Russia are unacceptable, and to the entire civilized world. Excellencies, the success of the process initiated in Switzerland last weekend depends on bringing on board as vast representation of the UN member states supporting the UN Charter as possible. Only with broad international support and comprehensive consultations can we work out a basis for the future peace agreement. The meeting in Bürgenstock proved that the critical mass is already there, and that alternatives proposed as stalling tactics to give Russia more time to continue its hostile activities are failing. Poland was among the signatories of the joint communique on the peace framework agreed in Switzerland. We fully support all three crucial aspects enumerated in the document. We deeply hope that the progress made in nuclear safety, food security, and on humanitarian issues will allow us to come closer to just peace. For us, there is no alternative to just peace, and there is no alternative to the UN Charter principles. Until that is achieved, Poland's support to Ukraine in all its forms will remain our top priority in all the multilateral forums. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. We very much appreciate the opportunity to address the Security Council today. This meeting could not be timelier, and thank you very much for setting it up. We want to join other delegations in thanking Switzerland for hosting the Peace for Ukraine Summit. More than 100 countries and international organizations participated in a truly global exchange on how to bring Russia's war of aggression to an end. The summit was an important milestone and an overwhelming manifestation of the international community's unity and its strong desire for peace, a peace that is comprehensive, just, lasting, based on international law and the UN Charter, and a peace that safeguards Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. Germany will continue to wholeheartedly support this inclusive and cross-regional effort, which prepares the ground for future dialogue, a dialogue that will become possible once Russia abandons its ambition to forcefully subjugate Ukraine, to erase Ukrainian identity, and to illegally absorb parts of Ukraine into the Russian Federation. Mr. President, we are not faced with a regional crisis. When a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council launches a war of aggression against a neighbor in flagrant violation of the UN Charter, underpinned by irresponsible nuclear threats, and by the taboo-breaking occupation and militarization of Zaporizhzhia, Europe's largest nuclear power plant, we are faced with an attack on the United Nations themselves. Russia's illegal war of aggression is marked by a complete indifference for the suffering of civilians and a blatant disregard for international law. As a result of its relentless shelling, missile and drone attacks, much of Ukraine's critical civilian infrastructure lays in ruins. It is therefore imperative that we tackle the question of reconstruction early on, while the war is unfortunately ongoing. Germany had the honor of co-hosting last week's International Ukraine Recovery Conference in Berlin with more than 3,400 representatives of the public and private sector and of international and non-governmental organizations. To make use of the vast potentials of Ukrainian society, empowerment of local actors and communities took center stage. The Berlin Conference showed broad unity and solidarity in support of Ukraine. Over 110 agreements were signed and investments amounting to $17 billion were announced. These investments will help Ukraine to rebuild and protect its vital energy infrastructure and help increase its resilience. We are now looking forward to next year's USC in Italy. Mr. President, I wish to close my remarks by once again urging Russia to stop this senseless aggression and to withdraw its troops from Ukraine immediately. I would like to call on all member states to support the peace track that was laid out in Switzerland last week to end this war in line with the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. President. Italy fully aligns itself with the statement by the European Union and would like to add some considerations in its national capacity. We commend the Swiss government for convening the Summit on Peace in Ukraine with the participation of around 100 delegations of countries from all continents and international organizations. It marked a first important step towards restoring diplomacy's rightful role, and we welcome the joint communiqué adopted. It was also important the UN presence at the conference. Italy remains committed to a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter, based on the principles of sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity. We firmly believe that the full implementation of these principles is a matter not only in the exclusive interests of Ukraine and Europe, but of the entire UN membership. The respect of these principles is what holds the international community together. If we resigned to the idea that might can rule over right, we would negate the principle of equality among member states, which is at the very core of the UN system. Therefore, our appeal to all member states of the UN community is as follows. Do not get misled by fake narratives confusing peace with surrender, or narratives artificially putting the West against the East or the South. The outcome of this conflict and the destiny of the system of rules based on the UN Charter are clearly intertwined. We are not at war with Russia or Russian people, but we are determined to continue to contrast Russia's policy of a blatant violation of the principles of the UN Charter. These principles have been strongly evoked and reaffirmed by the G7 Leaders Summit chaired by Italy last week, with the participation of the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. The summit delivered a clear message of support for Ukraine's independence and sovereignty. In this regard, the G7 also called on third countries to cease the transfer of dual-use materials that contribute to sustain Russia's invasion. The Peace Conference in Switzerland created a common framework that enabled discussions of topics related to conflict and of vital global interest for everyone, such as nuclear safety, food security, and the humanitarian dimension, including the protection of Ukrainian children. We must now call for an ever greater involvement of all UN member states to ensure that these three spheres of action receive consistent follow-up. We need diplomacy also to sustain the legitimate concerns and expectations of developing countries, which are impacted by the broader repercussions of this conflict in terms of disruption to global supply chains and food security. With this in mind, Mr. President, we encourage the participation of all global partners from Asia, Africa, and Latin America in these discussions. We remain committed to collaborating with all partners ready to support peace efforts. Now it's time to intensify our collective efforts to achieve this goal. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Italy for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.